I am Samantha Carter, the youngest of 5 siblings. If you think being the youngest means being spoiled or protected, then perhaps my story will make you think again. I was born when the gap between me and my older siblings was already a number so large it felt unreachable to any child. Ethan, Brandon, Vanessa, and Dylan, they had their own world long before I even understood what family meant. I grew up like a shadow trailing behind them. No one intentionally pushed me aside, but no one ever truly reached out either. The first memory I can clearly recall is my 7th birthday. I had once naively believed there would be a party just for me, a small cake, a few flickering candles, and tight, loving hugs. But that day, my birthday was merely a footnote in a celebration for Brandon's college acceptance. When I asked my mother, "Can I have my own candle to blow out?" she simply patted my head, smiled, and continued arranging candles atop a cake that had Brandon's name written boldly across it. I stood quietly in the corner for a long time, clutching a gift I had wrapped myself for my brother, and learned my first real lesson. Some people are born to be at the center of attention. And me? I was just part of the background. That feeling, that hollow, outsider feeling, never really left me. When Ethan married Sarah, I was 10 years old. 10 is a strange age, old enough to understand important moments are happening, yet young enough to be conveniently pushed aside by adults. They announced that the wedding would be child-free. I thought surely I would be the exception. In my own mind, I was no longer a child. I was the groom's sister. I remember shyly asking my mother if I could borrow her delicate pearl necklace, the one she kept tucked away carefully. I dreamed of wearing a pretty dress, standing quietly in the church, watching Ethan, the brother I had once believed to be my first real hero. Instead, my mother sat me down, her voice gentle but cold, and said, "This wedding is for adults only, Sam. You'll understand when you're older." I didn't understand. I only knew that that evening, while my parents dressed up for the wedding, I was left with a babysitter I had never met, along with the instruction, "Be good." And as the door clicked shut, I lay sprawled on the couch, staring at the ceiling, imagining a grand party happening somewhere, a party I would never be part of. When Ethan returned from his honeymoon, I waited just a small acknowledgement, a simple, "I wish you had been there." But he simply walked past me in the hallway, chatting with my parents about funny stories from the wedding, as if I had never existed. That was the first time I truly felt invisible. But it wouldn't be the last. 2 years later, Brandon got married. I was 12. I had changed by then, quieter, more mature, always trying to prove I was grown up enough to be seen. I didn't whine. I didn't beg. I simply sat there, waiting for an invitation that never came. Once again, the same sentence repeated itself. "It's an adult wedding, Samantha. No children." By then, I had learned how to hide my tears, how to sit still and nod like a well-behaved shadow. I no longer naively believed I would be invited. But deep down, a small part of me, the part that refused to die, still whispered, "Maybe next time?" If being left out of Ethan's wedding could still be excused as because I was too young, by the time I reached my teenage years, I could no longer lie to myself. At 15, I was old enough to recognize the things no one ever said aloud. I wasn't truly part of them. I was merely the last name on the family list, existing quietly and loosely on the edge. When my sister Vanessa got engaged, I allowed myself to hope. Vanessa was different from Ethan and Brandon. When I was little, she used to carry me around, brush my hair on lazy weekend mornings. I believed this time, things would be different. At first, it seemed like my hopes might come true. Vanessa didn't plan a no-kids wedding like my brothers. I overheard my mother say, "Everyone will be there this time, young and old alike." Silently, I thanked her. I pictured myself standing proudly in a pale blue silk dress, beaming with pride. But just a few weeks later, the family whispers began. The aunts, the uncles, those who treated controlling the wedding as their own hidden power play, started voicing concerns. Having kids around will make things messy. The formal atmosphere will be ruined. And eventually, Vanessa. gave in. "No one under 16 will be allowed," she said, a rule cold and indifferent. I still remember walking into her room one evening, heart pounding, struggling to keep my voice from trembling. "I'm just a few months away, Vanessa. I promise I'll be quiet. I swear." She looked at me, not angry, not annoyed, just sad. "If I make an exception for you, Sam, then what about the other younger cousins? I have to be fair." Fair. I heard the word as if it were a verdict. Fair meaning I, her own sister, was no different than distant cousins. Fair meaning I was expected to stay outside the door, just like those who were never truly part of the home. I didn't cry loudly like I had at 10 years old. I simply clenched my fists, forcing myself not to tremble as I left her room. But inside, something shattered, something I knew would never fully heal. So when Dylan, the youngest among the older siblings, later announced that his wedding would also be adults only, I didn't bother asking anymore. I didn't need to hear another refusal. I had grown too familiar with that feeling. The feeling of being forgotten. The cruelest irony was that my cousin Sophie, only a few months older than me, was invited. Because she had just turned 18. One invisible threshold was enough to determine who was worthy and who was not. I sent Dylan a short text. "Wishing you happiness. No flowers. No gifts. No demands. Just a simple blessing from someone who had long stopped hoping." I think it was during those years that I quietly learned how to let go. Not because I had stopped loving my family, but because some battles can't be won not when you were never even invited to fight. I learned how to shrink into myself, the way you curl up tightly when the cold creeps in, trying to preserve that last bit of warmth. And I told myself, maybe when I grow up, things will be different. But deep down, I already knew. Once a heart becomes accustomed to being forgotten, it no longer believes in vague promises. By the time I met Nathan Brooks, I was no longer the little girl standing silently behind the closed doors of her family. I had become a young woman, someone who knew how to smile when needed, how to stay quiet when loneliness crept in. Someone who had learned not to expect too much from anyone. Nathan wasn't the kind of person who caught your eye immediately. He wasn't loud. He wasn't flashy. He simply showed up in a way I wasn't used to. The first time I told him about the weddings I was never invited to, I didn't expect much. I was too accustomed to polite nods, to hollow reassurances like, they probably didn't mean it. But Nathan didn't do that. He sat there, quietly listening to every word I said, as if every shattered piece of my story deserved to be picked up, dusted off, and cherished. When I finished awkwardly trying to hide the embarrassment of having shared too much, Nathan just shook his head, gently, but firmly. "Sam, that's not normal. No one deserves to be treated like that, especially by their own family." I remember, I laughed a strained, awkward laugh, as if trying to smooth over the moment. But inside me, something shifted quietly. I had spent years convincing myself that what happened was normal. That every kid feels left out sometimes. That every family has its flaws. But hearing Nathan, an outsider, say out loud that it wasn't right made me realize I wasn't crazy. I wasn't overly sensitive. I had truly been treated badly. From that day, a quiet transformation began within me. I stopped blaming myself for feeling hurt. I started realizing that my pain wasn't a sign of weakness. It was proof of how deeply I had loved them, and how painfully that love had gone unanswered. And for the first time in my life, I allowed myself to wonder, if they can't value me, how much longer do I have to keep trying? Nathan never pushed me to cut ties with my family. He simply stayed a small, steady light in the darkness, enough for me to see the path ahead without ever forcing me to walk it before I was ready. And it was that patience, that warm silence, that gave me something I had never had before. The right to choose. The right to decide who deserved a place in my life. When Nathan proposed to me on a sunny afternoon by the banks of the Savannah River, I said yes without hesitation. Not just because I loved him, but because, for the first time, I knew I was choosing someone who would never leave me standing outside a closed door. someone who saw me fully and completely, even when my own family had chosen to look away. When Nathan and I started planning our wedding, I knew one thing for sure. This would be our day, not a day for people who only remembered me when it was convenient. We sat together, the guest list spread across the wooden table, the soft yellow light casting our shadows onto each other like a silent vow. Nathan looked at me, waiting. He didn't say anything, but I knew he understood. This wasn't just about picking who would attend. It was a moment for me to ask myself, who truly loves me? Who is merely present in my life out of hollow obligation? And for the first time, I answered without hesitation, I will choose the people who chose me. So, when it came time to write the names, I left out Ethan, Brandon, Vanessa, and Dylan. Not out of anger. Not out of spite. Just simply because they no longer belonged in this new chapter of my life. I knew it wouldn't go unnoticed. My family was never good at accepting the loss of control. 2 months before the wedding, my phone rang. Mom. I hesitated for a second before picking up. Her voice came through, soft, so soft that I immediately grew wary. Sam, I heard you sent the invitations already, but your siblings say they haven't received theirs. Maybe they got lost? I took a deep breath. The air around me seemed to grow heavy. They didn't get lost, Mom, I said, keeping my voice calm. I didn't send them. A heavy silence on the other end. Then the familiar explosion of anger poured through the line. How could you do this? They're your family. Are you trying to humiliate us? I closed my eyes for a moment. I thought I would feel pain, guilt, but all I felt was a profound stillness, a stillness I had spent years fighting to reclaim. Mom, I said slowly, choosing each word with my whole heart. I wasn't there for their biggest moments, because to them, I didn't matter enough. So why, in the biggest moment of my life, should I give them a place in my heart? I heard her sob on the other end. But this time, I wasn't pulled back into the familiar cycle, the cycle of guilt, of self-blame, of trying to patch together a family that never truly wanted to hold me. That night, the family group chat exploded. Rachel, as usual, tried to start diplomatically. Sam, maybe the postal service messed up? We haven't gotten our invites yet. Brandon was more direct. What's going on? Why weren't we invited? I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, weighing dozens of possible responses. I could have listed every time they hurt me. I could have explained that this decision wasn't impulsive, but the result of a lifetime of being left out. But then I realized I didn't owe them an explanation anymore. So I left their messages on read and said nothing. Nathan sat next to me the whole time, his hand silently holding mine. He didn't need to say anything. His presence was enough to make me feel I wasn't alone. I know they'll make me the villain in their version of the story, I said, my voice low. The ungrateful daughter, the bitter little sister. Nathan just chuckled softly, pulling me into his arms. Let them tell their story. You're writing your own. And for the first time, I believed it was true. That I was no longer the child sitting in the corner, waiting to be invited in. I was the one opening my own door and choosing who gets to step inside. I knew that not inviting them to my wedding wouldn't just end with a few confused messages. I knew that in my family, being rejected was never an acceptable possibility. They weren't used to someone drawing a line they couldn't cross. And sure enough, the storm came faster than I expected. Just days after the family group chat exploded, I received a string of missed calls from Mom, from Dad, even from Ethan. I stayed silent. I knew that if I picked up, I would be pulled back into the familiar cycle. They accuse, I defend, and somehow, I end up feeling guilty even though this pain hadn't started with me. But they didn't give up easily. The next morning, while I was making coffee in our sunlit kitchen, there was a loud knock at the door. Nathan moved toward it first, but I gestured for him to stay back. I knew this was a battle I had to fight for myself. When I opened the door, I wasn't surprised. Mom stood there, her face flushed with anger. Dad standing quietly behind her, avoiding my eyes. Sam, Mom began, her voice trembling from restraint. What are you doing? Not inviting your own siblings? Are you trying to shame the entire family? I stayed calm. I knew she didn't really care about my feelings. She cared about the family's image in the eyes of others. I'm not trying to shame anyone, Mom, I said evenly. I'm just inviting the people who truly want to be there for me. Mom glared at me as if I had just uttered something unspeakable. You're still hung up on childhood slights? You're going to tear apart this family over some old weddings you didn't attend? I'm not tearing anything apart, Mom, I said, feeling a strange sadness settle inside me. This family left me standing outside a long time ago. I'm just choosing not to wait by the door anymore. A heavy silence fell between us, thick as a wall. Dad, who had remained silent through so many of my early wounds, finally spoke up. Sam, you're making a big deal out of nothing. It was just rules about kids at weddings. You were young, how could you blame anyone? I turned to him, my eyes no longer brimming with tears like they had when I was 10. I know, I was young, but when it happens 4 times, 5 times it stops being an accident, Dad. It becomes a choice. And now, I'm making mine choosing myself. Mom started crying an old habit whenever logic failed her. She sobbed, accusing me of being ungrateful, of destroying the family. I stood there, listening to each accusation fall into the void. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel guilty. I just felt free. When they left, Nathan wrapped me in his arms, holding me tightly. Are you okay? He asked, his voice low and warm. I nodded. Yes. There was a very real sadness pulsing quietly inside me, the grief of realizing that sometimes your blood relatives aren't your safe place. But intertwined with that sadness was a fierce pride. I hadn't backed down. In the days that followed, the attacks continued. Brandon called me selfish. Vanessa posted cryptic statuses about people who forget their own blood. Ethan sent a long text about forgiveness and family loyalty. I read it all, and I didn't reply. I knew that any words I said now would just be twisted, used against me. I had lived enough to understand. Sometimes, silence is the strongest form of self-protection. So, one by one, I started blocking them. Not because I hated them, but because I loved myself more than I was willing to sacrifice just to maintain an image of family. In that new, aching silence, I felt for the first time in my life like I could finally breathe. And I knew that even though the road ahead would still be hard, this time I wouldn't be walking it alone. The final weeks before the wedding passed, like a gentle calm between storms. I can't say everything was completely peaceful. The wounds from my family, the accusations, the silent betrayals were still there, like scratches that hadn't quite healed. But for the first time in my life, I didn't let that sadness rule me. I chose differently. I chose joy and I protected it like a precious treasure. Nathan and I finalized the last details of our wedding together. No complicated extravagance, no endless guest lists meant to please others. Only the people who truly loved us. We chose to hold the ceremony in a small garden, just outside Savannah Moonlight Garden, where tiny fairy lights swayed in the breeze and climbing roses wrapped each wooden pillar like silent embraces. When I stood in that garden, holding the simple bouquet that Lily, my best friend and maid of honor, had lovingly crafted by hand, I felt something I hadn't felt in all those years. I belonged here. No striving. No pleading. No standing in the corners, hoping someone would notice me. I was present whole, welcomed. Of course, moments of weakness still crept in. On the morning of the wedding, as I sat before the mirror adjusting my makeup, I caught myself wondering, what if Mom were here? What if Ethan, Vanessa, Brandon, or Dylan were here? But Lily, ever intuitive, sat down beside me, placed a hand on my shoulder, and whispered, Sam, your feelings are valid. You have the right to grieve. But today, you also have the right to choose joy over sorrow. I looked at myself in the mirror, hair neatly pinned, a simple yet elegant white dress, eyes tinged with sadness but shining still, and I smiled. I choose happiness, I whispered, like a vow to myself. The ceremony was warm, genuine. Nathan waited for me beneath a white floral arch, his eyes drawing the entire clear sky toward me. No trace of judgment, expectation, or pretense. Only love, quiet, steady, and complete. As I walked down the petal-strewn aisle, my heart felt weightless. All the hurt, all the childhood years spent waiting at the edges, all the weddings I was never allowed to attend, it all dissolved into the air, leaving behind a soft, open space ready to be filled with something new. We read our vows beneath the lush green canopy. Nathan looked into my eyes, his voice warm and sure. I promise to listen to you, even when the world outside turns away. I promise you'll never again stand alone, in the dark corners of any room. Hearing those words, the walls I had built around my heart for so long for protection began to melt away. When it was my turn, I grasped his hands tightly, feeling the steady rhythm of life beneath his warm skin. I promise to trust in love in you and in myself. And I promise never to let the fears of the past keep us from building our future. Those vows meant more to me than any grand ceremony I had ever been excluded from. Because for the first time, I didn't have to beg for love. That evening, under twinkling lights and warm laughter, I tucked myself into a corner of the garden, watching the friends and new family who had chosen to be there not out of obligation, not for appearances, but for real love. And I realized, happiness isn't having everything you ever wished for. Happiness is when you no longer have to convince anyone to love you. I once thought that after the wedding, everything would settle down. I had hoped that once my family realized I was no longer playing by their old rules, they would get tired and let go. That they would find someone else to blame and leave me be. But I had overestimated their capacity for acceptance. Just 1 week after the ceremony, new messages flooded in. No more blessings, no polite small talk. Only poisoned arrows aimed straight at the softest parts they still believed I exposed. Rachel sent a short, cutting message. Saw the wedding photos. Guess it matches your new style, simple to the point of dullness. Brandon followed with a long-winded email, accusing me of bringing shame to the family and betraying the sacrifices made to raise me. Even Ethan, the brother I once idolized, didn't hold back. Can't believe you turned into this. Cold, petty, ungrateful. I read them all, with dry eyes, with a heart that no longer waited for apologies from people who never thought they were wrong. Nathan, noticing my silence, pulled me into his arms, a gesture that by now had become second nature to him. You okay? He asked. Yeah, I whispered. I'm just sad. Not because they haven't changed, but because I spent so many years hoping they would. A few days later, my mother made her move. She showed up at our home no longer tearful or pleading, but coldly accusatory. Her gaze swept through our small, sunlit apartment, searching for evidence that I was struggling without them. Your cousin told me, she began, her voice dripping with a smug triumph, that your little wedding barely had a few dozen people. Are you proud of that tiny celebration? I looked at her, feeling a surprising calm. Mom, I said, it was the happiest day of my life. And I'm proud because every single person there loved me truly. She scoffed, shaking her head as if I were a foolish child lost in fantasy. You'll regret this, Samantha, she sneered. Family is forever. Friends, husbands, they can leave you anytime. I listened, and instead of pain, I only felt sorrow. Not sorrow for myself, but for her, and for everyone who had never understood that. Family isn't the people who birth you. Family is the people who choose to stay with unconditional love. After that day, I did what I had feared for so many years. I began to let go. I blocked each number that continued sending venomous words. I left the toxic family group chats. I unfollowed the social media pages where my siblings posted thinly veiled jabs. No explanations. No battles. Just retreat. And when the final silence wrapped around me, I thought I would feel empty. But strangely, all I felt was relief. For the first time, I wasn't suffocated by expectations, obligations, or guilt. I could breathe fully. I could love without fear. I could exist without asking for permission. One evening, as Nathan and I sat on our small balcony, watching the sunset stretch across the treetops, he asked, "Do you have any regrets?" I thought for a moment, then shook my head. "No," I whispered. "I only wish I'd done it sooner." Nathan squeezed my hand, needing no further words. Between us, every answer was already there in our gaze, in our breath, in the newfound peace we were building together. It turns out, letting go isn't abandoning love. It's choosing to love in the right place, with the right people, starting with yourself. And that, perhaps, is the greatest gift life has ever given me. There are some mornings when I wake up and, in that fleeting moment between dream and reality, I forget I once carried such a heavy burden called family on my shoulders. I am simply Samantha Carter, a young woman, waking up in a sun-drenched apartment, beside the person she loves. The old wounds are still there. I don't fool myself into believing that time can erase everything. But they no longer bleed. They have become scars, reminding me that I was once hurt, and that I survived. One late afternoon, I stopped by Moonlight Garden, the place where Nathan and I held our wedding. The garden was silent, with only the whisper of the wind through the trees and the lingering scent of jasmine from the summer. I walked slowly along the stone path, letting my fingers brush gently over the climbing roses. With each step, it felt like I was gathering fragments of memories, no longer heavy, but as light as falling petals. Here, under this canopy of trees, I had vowed not to let the past define my future. And I had kept that vow. My old family, the siblings who turned their backs, the furious phone calls, the messages dripping with blame were now just faint echoes behind me. Occasionally, a stray message would appear, a distant relative checking in, subtly hinting at rebuilding family ties. I would read it, smile gently, and quietly delete it. Not out of anger, but because I understood, not every door needs to be reopened. Not every thread needs to be rewoven. Nathan and I spent our time building our own little nest. We repainted the kitchen in a soft olive green, my favorite color. We carefully picked out rustic wooden chairs for our reading nook. We planted pots of bright yellow daisies on the balcony, so that every morning when I woke up, the first thing I saw was a burst of sunshine greeting me. Each of these small acts, from choosing a paint color to watering a flower, was a gentle reminder. I was rewriting my story. A story where indifference had no place, where invisible wounds no longer bled. One evening, while I was sketching interior designs for a new project, Nathan walked in with 2 steaming cups of tea. He placed one in front of me and sat down across from me, his eyes filled with a calmness I once thought only existed in books. "Do you still think about them?" He asked, no judgment, only pure concern. I thought for a moment. Yes, I still remembered. But no longer as burning memories searing through my chest, just distant fragments like the echo of a church bell through a misty morning. "I remember," I replied, my voice as soft as the breeze. "But I don't regret anymore." Nathan smiled, a smile that melted every shadow lingering inside me. "That's enough," he said. I looked out the window. The night sky stretched endlessly, scattered with stars, silent, distant, but unwavering. And I realized, happiness isn't about forgetting every hurt. Happiness is when you can smile alongside your pain, turning it into solid ground to walk forward, instead of chains that hold you down. I closed my sketchbook, cradling the cup of tea Nathan had placed in my hands. Warmth spread from my palms straight into my heart. In that moment, I knew I had truly completed the journey. Not because I had won, but because I no longer needed to fight. I had chosen myself. I had chosen happiness. And this time, no one could ever take that away from me. I once thought I needed an apology, a regretful glance, an open embrace, an admission that I had been treated unfairly. I spent many years of my life waiting for that, like a child standing in the rain, face turned upward, waiting for sunlight. But then I realized, peace doesn't come from others' acknowledgement. Peace comes when you stop placing your worth in the hands of those who never knew how to treasure it. The day I chose not to invite them to my wedding, I wasn't seeking revenge. I wasn't trying to hurt them the way they had hurt me. I simply chose not to let them walk into the new chapter of my life. And the miraculous thing was, when I stopped trying to fix a relationship that wasn't meant for me, when I stopped clinging to people who never truly saw me, my heart began to make space for better things. For true love. For real friendships. For myself, a version of me that didn't need permission to exist. I cannot change the past. I cannot go back in time to be the child who was embraced instead of left behind. But I can choose how I move forward. And I choose to walk on, with a quiet pride, no resentment, no demands, no looking back. Because in the end, true happiness isn't about being accepted by everyone. Happiness is finding those who never make you question your own worth. If you are reading this, and you have ever felt forgotten, overlooked, or had to convince yourself that you were okay, know this. You deserve so much more. You are not selfish for setting boundaries. You are not cruel for choosing yourself. You are not ungrateful for protecting your heart from wounds that have been inflicted too many times. You are simply learning to love yourself in the way others should have long ago. And one day, just like me, you will sit in a room bathed in your own light, looking back at the years gone by, no longer with hatred, no longer with regret, only with a peaceful smile and a quiet whisper in your heart. I have come home right here, within myself.